Okay, cool. Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining today. I'm Tim Smith. I'm an officer for the Aggie Artificial Intelligence Society. Today is a really fun event that we're throwing, which is a partnership between us, the Aggie AI Society, as well as the Biomedical Sciences Association. So if you're here with BSA, just like quick, preview of coming attractions, this meeting is worth credit, like meeting credit of some sort. I'm not really sure what it's worth, and I don't understand the currency of your system. But it is worth something. So at the end of the meeting, I'll send a link in the chat or throw up a QR code so that you can sign in to receive credit. So without further ado, I'd like to announce or introduce our speaker today. Our speaker is Kenneth Cuker. Kenneth is a journalist, a writer, and the deputy executive editor for The Economist. He's written the extraordinarily best-selling book, Big Data, which has sold over 2 million copies worldwide. That book is actually, in large part, the way in which the term big data has become the popularized household name that it is today, which is really cool. His most recent book, Framers, explores the unique ways that human mental models can reason in ways that AI cannot. Kenneth also has spoken on the TEDx stage on multiple occasions, and today he's going to be talking to us about big data and its use in medicine and society. So Kenneth, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Tim. It's a very nice introduction. I'm, of course, incredibly embarrassed and almost rebelling at the idea that I'm going to offer some value that you're going to get a form of academic credit for it. I want to embrace the fact that and wraith to say that that's not going to be the case. Secondly, of course, it is 11:30 at night, so I can't actually, be sure that I'm going to be compos mentis. What I do have to, put forward as a standard is that I can't actually be so boring that I put myself asleep. That to me would be an all-time low. Unprecedented, but we'll see. We'll see if that happens. I'm standing up. I could fall down. Could hurt myself. I'll need someone in healthcare to help me. Data will help me. Where to begin? Let's begin with seeing if I can actually make the first thing happen, which is the screen sharing. And if that happens, then the rest should go perfectly well. So I'm going to go here. I'm going to do entire screen. No. Let's see. It doesn't look like it's allow Zoom Workplace to share your screen, open screen settings. So I've got open screen settings. Oh, you know what it is? I've got a new computer and I've had to download new things. And so here we go. So the Zoom is new. Quit and reopen. I'm going to quit and reopen. I'll be right back.
Go for it. The show must go on. We'll wait for you.
Oh, Zoom. You can have such a big market capitalization, but you still make these rookie errors. Okay. But so do I without the market cap. Let's see if I can, this time, make the screen sharing work. I'm sure I can. I go like this, and then I have to probably do this. 4 years after COVID, and I still can't get my screen to share. Okay. In theory, you guys see me, and then you also see the slides. Is that right?
Yes, all good.
Okay, good. So we can rock and roll. Let's see if I can collapse myself. Good. All right, fantastic. So what I do want to talk about under Tim's great guidance is a bit about healthcare, of which I'm not a specialist, but someone who sort of looks at it in his peripheral vision, thinking about data, thinking about society, and then also how to reframe society using data and putting it at the front of all that happens, rather than what I believe now is sort of an afterthought in the background. We can think of data a little bit like we think of maybe salt versus yeast. Yeast gets baked into the product, salt gets sprinkled on top, and I want to take it from something that's just sort of added to all that happens and is actually the primary ingredient of it. And I think we have a moral obligation to do that. Let's see if I can get my slides to advance. Oh, didn't expect this not to work. Let's see if this works this way. Good. Okay. So let's start with bloodletting. Uh, Perhaps like me, you yourself have posed the question, how is it that society could have actually like literally ripped open people's veins or arteries? Don't even know which one, because it's just so acid. It's just so crazy to think that has happened. Open up and let people who are ill and deplete some of their blood. I mean, it just seems so preposterous that this would be a medical intervention. Yet the earliest, evidence of bloodletting was thousands of years ago. Egyptians did it, obviously the Greeks, the Romans, and it persisted weirdly until the early 1900s. So around the time of World War One, there were still doctors who'd been trained in the old ways in the 1800s who were still prescribing bloodletting. I know what some of you are about to say. I'll get to that. Wait for it. So you would think that that people could see that that this is actually harming people and not. But of course, if you think about it a little bit further, there's actually a lot of data to support bloodletting. Think about it. The people, there's always going to be some cohort of people who are going to be cured, and they're going to say, "If oh, thank God for the doctor. He has saved my life. It's incredible. All that blood that was cast from my body, that bad blood, and here I am to talk about how good he was." So there's survivor bias, literally. Those who say they worked, they did, and of course those who perished. Well, the case was so difficult they had nothing but to die. Even the best treatment in the world of bloodletting wouldn't have worked. So it was a self-validating form of data analysis. And there was one guy, a Frenchman, who wanted to question this in the early 1800s, Pierre Charles Alexandre Loubet. Now, I know what you're thinking. I'm thinking the same thing too. Does he have a last name? He does have a last name. That's his last name. So even with such a strange French set of names, he was able to think about the world in a different way. And what he did is he collected data, but better data, more data. He segmented his patients into cohorts in terms of like look-alike groups. And he was able to look at different courses of treatment. And he was able to identify using the data and against everyone who was against, because the whole medical establishment was against his ideas because it was just indoctrinated that bloodletting worked. I mean, Galen, the great, physician of the Middle Ages, it just seemed preposterous to even question this. Yet he did, and he was able to show and demonstrate with data that, in fact, bloodletting didn't work, that it was actually killing their patients. The test case was pneumonia, so it was actually interestingly an easy test case. What some of you are going to say, well, we're bringing back bloodletting, aren't we? And isn't it good in certain instances? And don't we actually, use medical leeches today? And the answer is yeah, absolutely. It's so interesting actually that there's domains in medicine where bloodletting actually does work. You could also understand why the practice continued for as long as it did, because it wasn't completely ridiculous, even though there was no causal theory, because the idea of having a scientific method and causal theory in the Middle Ages until we have the scientific method probably around between about 1450 and 1650, really about 1650 onwards, that we actually had science to actually validate our understandings and use basic causal reasoning to make decisions. But before then, you could understand why the practice continued, because actually it wasn't completely asinine, even though they didn't know why. It was working in the theory that they had on it, that it was bad blood that you had to extinguish from the spirit system, just like you might have bad spirits, you bring in a priest to exorcise it from the system, was cockamamie. Although, maybe we'll find out that that's not so cockamamie. I'm going to be open-minded, weirdly enough, about these things. So what does that mean? It's interesting that if you look at the world today, everything in the world, but in particular just medicine, we haven't really advanced that much since the days of bloodletting, because there's so much that we do in healthcare that when I look at it, I think it's really quite barbaric and medieval. And it's particularly in the way that we handle data. Because you go into a medical setting and they collect the data. Sometimes they store it. When I wrote the book Big Data, which was based on reporting about 15 years ago, and then it came out a little bit over 10 years ago, but you would be surprised, I think, for some of you, if I want to has my reference of 15 years ago. For some of you, you were toddlers there. So it's interesting. I think that's so interesting. But I really have to insist that when I journeyed into the world of data around, well, initially having a sort of an insight from on high around 2004 about how the world could be rendered into this, into all that was under the sun could be rendered as empirical information with a data quotient to it, and you could understand it better and more profoundly, and then optimize all that was under the sun through the lens of data. I then wrote the book, that was 2004, wrote the book on, reported in 2009, cover story, The Economist 2010, introducing the word big data to a mainstream audience. Then the book came out like 2012 or so, maybe 2013. But the point is that so around 2010, in healthcare settings, the data was just simply lost. It was literally thrown out at the end of treatment, like dirty soiled bandages, which made no sense. I thought, like, it's precious. This is the most important, valuable asset. You have 10,000 people in Britain who are going to have an appendectomy, and this sort of treatment is good in post-op, and this one doesn't work for these sorts of people post-op. There is an information quotient. It's latent in the information. If you only kept it and analyzed it, you'd learn something new that would lower costs and improve patient outcomes. And it would be not just that. Improved patient outcomes just sounds like sort of medical claptrap, but what it really means is that at the other end of you and I is a person with people who love them, who has a care, whose life is precious, and we have a sacred duty to ease suffering where we can and support life where we can, I believe. And I think there's a good foundation that our best of our society is based on that. So why aren't we using our data? We're now collecting it. It's better, but it's not perfect. But we're still, I think, still closer to medieval times than we are to modern times in our use of data. So what is actually to play for? Let me go through a few examples of how I'll call it big data, which is a classic machine learning, shorthand for machine learning, those basic techniques or data analysis techniques, analytics, how we can use data more effectively to do some really extraordinary things, and we should be doing it. Then look at classical artificial intelligence, more of a serious ML, and then deep learning approach, and then make some more inferences about how we have this data duty of care, that we actually should put data front and center. So let's look at something really rudimentary. And this data now is from this example, the studies from about 10 years ago, maybe a little longer, of using web searches to identify adverse drug interactions. So if you were to identify the traits of, if you were taking one medication and you were to take another and they were to have an interaction that was not on the label, maybe not tested, but it was actually going to harm you, in this case, hyperglycemia, how would you know? Well, you have these telltale traits of hyperglycemia, and you can see what some of them are there. And what you would be able to do is you would be able to look at searches for people who have these traits, but they wouldn't actually probably say hunger, thirst, fatigue, blurred vision. You might say, I'm tired, not fatigue. So you wouldn't know how to predict fatigue, but you would be able to find proxies for it. And that's where some of the machine learning comes in. And what you'd be able to then do is put down either the names of drugs that they're taking or their ailment. And usually if you're going to be Googling that, you are either a healthcare professional or you're actually a patient, you're taking it. So it's a very strong signal. And what happens is that when you do that, you can identify if the person is Googling both for either the symptoms, disease categories, or the name of the drugs of two different drugs, as well as hyperglycemic symptoms. So when researchers looked at over a year of 82 million queries, which I should also stress today, that is nothing. And 15 years ago or so, 10 years ago, was a vast amount. And it was really breathtaking to see, well, you can do that. You just look at that area of A in that Venn diagram and you think, okay, something special is happening here. And so when the researchers did that, what they found is that there was always some background noise of people just searching for things randomly that would relate to these three different categories. And there were some people who searched for pravastatin, which is a form of statin, another one for paroxetine, which is, I believe, a blood thinner. But then if you were searching for, in terms of searching for symptoms, you had more than twice the likelihood of searching for those symptoms of hyperglycemia if you've also mentioned in your searches both drugs together, not one or the other, that red line on top at 10%. So that's a smoking gun. I mean, that's such a strong signal in data that you can say, hey, something's there. Now, of course, it's a correlation. There's no causation. So you can't get like the FDA cops to knock down the door of the drug company and sort of do a perp walk with the drug executives to say, hey, what are you doing? You're doing terrible things, and you should put it on the label that you have this adverse drug interaction when you don't, because it wasn't part of the original study when they were getting the clinical approval. But what you do have, even if you don't have that causal connection, is just enough to go on with a correlation that you can do further studies and start conversations, in this case, with the drug companies where they can start doing the studies as well and get that contraindication on the label, which is what they did. Okay, and that's the whole point, that there was a suspicion that it was creating this problem. Now through searches, you could see it. And now you'd also be able to identify, well, who's searching for it. You could find a way to discreetly prompt them to go see their GP and to support them for their medical needs, to get a doctor to explain to them what's going on with them. And of course, you have to be super discreet. And it's a great, interesting question in terms of who pings whom, who knows this information. But the information is really valuable. And if you can think about it now, Bing, which did this, Microsoft Bing search engine, but it could have been Google. That data is now so valuable that if you're a drug company, you really want this. If you're a patient or a patient group, you really want this. And if you're the FDA, you really want this as well. So maybe Bing should not just sell ads along with its searches, but should actually be licensing its data to healthcare groups. Now, you can imagine the sort of outcry from the public thinking about privacy and insurance that would come with that, but maybe we could manage that. I believe that we can if we're a wise society and using our values. Let me give another example that gets a little bit more fuller in terms of the use of data, and in this case, artificial intelligence, because that was basically just classical statistics or business analytics from, well, it depends on how you want to measure it. I'm a bit of a purist in terms of statistics, so I would say it's about a century old techniques. Really, it's over the last 20 years that was going outside of the sciences and into business. But it's kind of robust, but it wasn't unheard of to have done in the past. But it's very serious as a level of statistical analysis. But modern artificial intelligence, of course, is sort of its cornerstone is statistics. It wasn't always that way. It's the big shift in AI that happened around the year 2000. Prior to that, it was something called symbolic AI, in which we were trying to try to encode instructions, explicit instructions, computer programming through list instructions, list programming, and make a long list of how a computer should mimic a human mind and do all the things that humans do. But it was a very brittle way of doing things. And although it showed some promise, couldn't really scale very well, of course. And so we shifted that whole approach to the machine learning approach, which was learning from data. Don't give the computer specific instructions, explicit instructions on what you want it to do for its output. You give it a lot of data and you tell the machine to infer for itself what are the patterns that best predict handwriting analysis or voice analysis or machine readable images. And then it was able to identify, if you will, what a cat looks like through all the images of cats and then do that. And of course, in the last several years, we were able to take that idea of predicting patterns into generating novel patterns based on the original pattern in the training set. So we don't have now, we not only do we now have artificial intelligence that makes a prediction, but we have AI that is generative as well. So that's the generative AI bit. Let's go back a little bit now to around 2010. So we're still in the beginning of this, what we'll call the big data era, and we're still using a more primitive form of machine learning. deep learning, which is just a far more souped up way of doing classical machine learning. I don't think we should get into the technology, but we can talk a little bit about later if you like. So there we had a great paper in 2011 from Andrew Beck at Harvard and Daphne Kollner, who was the last author, so she's in the et al. From Stanford. And what they were trying to do is they were trying to identify cases of breast cancer, severe breast cancer, from biopsies to see if a pathology, an artificial intelligence-based pathologist could perform as well as a regular human pathologist. And it turns out that they were able to do this. If you are a medical researcher, you know that this slide is simply a colorful slide of cells. It's not cancer cells, and it's not cancer cells of breast cells, but let's just go with it. A pretty slide. So I just full disclosure, because you'd probably say, hey, you're a fraud. But I am giving you citations for all of this. So I'm not, even if I am a fraud in this respect, I'm not in terms of the data that I'm giving you for it. So so what happened? So they looked at I don't know, tens of thousands of patient records, and they matched the patient survival records with the biopsies and asked the machine if they could predict from the patient survival rates if they could identify cases of severe cancer and where, why, what it looked for. And sure enough, the artificial intelligence, the algorithmic pathologist was able to identify 11 telltale signs that best predicted that the biopsy was severely cancerous. But the interesting thing was that the medical literature only knew of 8 of them. 3 of the things that were spotted by AI were invisible to the human eye. In particular, it was looking in the stroma, or the cellular material, and it was able to look at the distance between cells, not just counting the number of cells. It's that distance of cells in the cellular material, which was one of the signals that was something that the researchers earlier, or I should say the pathologists in an earlier generation, just didn't know, or just right before then, didn't know to look for. So AI was now able to identify something that human beings didn't know. We were piercing the frontier of knowledge with AI, although, keep in mind, interestingly, in classical ML, we were able to identify what it was, the traits that it was able to identify. But of course, that needed a human being to sort of cogitate on it. So it gets even better, right? It gets even spookier. So research in 2018 from Google looked at whether you could identify cardiac incidences through ordinary retina scans, the kind of basic scan that you get when you go to get a set of eyeglasses on the main street. So you look at it, and they were able to do some really incredible things. So the first thing, just by the retina scan, they could identify the age of the smoker to about 75%, plus or minus 5 years. Super interesting. Wow, who knew that the retina could do that? The second thing is you could identify if the person was a smoker or not at around 71%, which is far more than she has, right? So that's great. But when they ran it through the system and wanted to identify if they could identify male or female of the patient that gave the retina scan, it was like 97%. Now that was weird, because there was no theory in ophthalmology that explains what it is that the artificial intelligence algorithm was looking at, deep learning algorithm, that was able to make the prediction on gender, okay, or sex to be specific. That you could, that it could be incredibly accurate, yet we still don't know what it's seeing in the retina that it's used to make its prediction. So now already we have artificial intelligence that has surpassed the human mind. That is what is to play for. And when people talk about super intelligence, my view is, like, in some respects, we're already there. We already have it. I mean, we certainly have it in terms of memory. We have computers that are far super intelligent than we are in processing speeds. Obviously, it works at the speed of light, or at least the speed of a microprocessor. So it's almost an atomic scale speed. But here as well, in the past, I'm thinking sort of the foundation of the Enlightenment and humanism in the Middle Ages, where sort of the mind of mankind came to the fore and was put on the pedestal as the fount of all that was knowable. Prior to that golden period, in the 1600s, I'm thinking, but basically from 1400 to 1700, the era of Galileo and Newton, and among so many others, that the human mind, rather than taking on faith how the world would work, the human mind became the fount of all that was knowable, because we could use our rational thinking to identify it, and our reason replaced taking it on faith. Now we've reversed the situation again, in which with all of our science based on our rational thinking, we've created a tool in which it is able to identify something new, and we don't understand how it is that it sees what it sees, and we have to accept its finding again on faith. It's a nice irony. But the point is that AI has surpassed human intelligence in terms of being able to understand the world. Where many people look at AI and say it's artificial intelligence, but we don't really know what the I is. We don't know what intelligence is. Is it really intelligent? It's not really intelligence like I think of it as intelligence, goes the argument. I think that's wrong. I think that's backwards, actually. A better way of thinking about it is, at least for myself, is that I don't think it's A. I think it's I. I think that computer algorithmic deep learning and outputs, it is intelligence. It's another form of intelligence. We are intelligent. The machine is intelligent. Both are intelligence. There's nothing artificial about it. So I question the A, not the I. However, in the world that we're in, I think this is an opportunity. If the data is so powerful that we can actually pierce the frontier of knowledge to learn new things, then we might want to reframe how we see the world in terms of the use of data in society, and in particular in healthcare. And this sort of reframing is a little bit like what happened in the Galilean shift, in which we thought that the Earth was the center of the universe, and we found out, or certainly the solar system, well, we didn't have that term yet, but then we realized that the Earth was just one of numbers of planets that were rotating around the Earth. And although the Copernican diagram was wrong, interestingly, it's not a circle, it's an ellipsis, nevertheless, or it's elliptical, I should say, nevertheless, it was a better model. And because it was a better model, it fit the circumstances that we were in. And we need to reframe our model of how we see AI in society. Now, everyone knows what this logo is. It is OpenAI. And so let me just take a very quick second to talk about the limitations of artificial intelligence. And I'm going to do that to pick on OpenAI. Totally unjustly, but they deserve it, because as great as they are, there are some shortcomings that they don't really talk about as loudly as they could. So I think you probably all know very basically how an LLM works, right? We are not going to go into it in any deep way, but I'm just going to give a very basic summary so that I can make a point about its shortcoming. So imagine you take, the first thing you need to do is take the words, you break them into tokens, and you sort of have to spatially situate them so that you can and cluster them so you can identify the relations between words, so that it can be this big autocomplete of the next word ahead, but do it at the paragraph scale. So it finds relationships between the words in its training data, and its training data is gazillions numbers of words of all the English language and all of the text that it could possibly hoover up, including the copyrighted works that it doesn't pay and compensate creators for. So queen and king are obviously related. It's a monarchy. Woman and man is related as well. These are sexes or genders. And then, obviously queen and woman are related, and king and man. So in this spatially situated sort of, imagine a three-dimensional area in which you take all the words, yes, it's in tokens and it's in numbers, but let's just use words, the words of the English language, and you were to place them there so that if you have ice and you have intrinsic, they're going to be probably far away, or ice and kettle might be far away, but ice and cream will be close together, and ice water will be close together, and ice skating will be close together, because they're more frequently seen together in the training set. So you've got queen and king and woman and man, and they're sort of clustered a little bit together. It can identify the relationships between the two. But of course, you'd also have pawn, and pawn wouldn't be too distant from queen, because queen doesn't simply mean monarchy, but is also queen is a board piece on chess, as a pawn is, and so they're together. But if you then saw woman and lawyer, well, how would that be situated in our three-dimensional plane? Would it be clustered far or close? Well, imagine we don't have an LLM from 2021 or 2024, but we have an LLM from 1924. Okay, the 1924 LLM, where's woman and lawyer? Well, it almost doesn't exist. There's no relationship between them. There were no women lawyers. There's no female lawyers in 1924, right? Lawyer at the time, it wasn't, it took a human mind to identify the fact that a lawyer didn't describe a male, but described an occupation, and that both women and men could be lawyers. But it wasn't in the training data 100 years ago. It is today. In fact, ironically, today there's more women in American law schools than there are men. Famously, the great jurist Ruth Bader Ginsburg, in her first year at Harvard Law School, was invited to the dean's house for a tea, and he asked her point blank, "How does it feel to take the place of a male breadwinner at Harvard Law School?" Right? She was stunned, speechless that that was happening, and of course, he wasn't doing that because he was mean. He admitted to her, after all, he knew exactly what he was doing. He was being playful, as one is in law school, to sort of test you, check against the boards, if you will, a little bit like ice hockey, because when you leave law school, you're going to have to play against big people to check against the boards with, with a little bit more roughness. So it was a little bit of a test. But the point is that today it would be in the training setup, but before it wouldn't. Or if you think about it this way, if you ask the LLM in 1800 where the Earth is, they would say it's at the, or actually before Galileo, I should say, in the training data, all of the evidence would have said in the LLM, because it would have been textual information, that the Earth was at the center of the universe. And of course, we know that that's actually not true. So the LLM is inherently uh, has inherent shortcomings, and I only point that out because all of artificial intelligence, in different ways, has inherent shortcomings. It's not going to be the full answer, and we're going to always be correcting some, but always living with others, and having to accept the fact that it has shortcomings. Yet we have this vision of what we're going to be able to do with artificial intelligence, which I totally believe in and I think we should be pursuing. Predicting sepsis from patient data, as Jenna Wines is doing at the University of Michigan. Traditionally, before she was very young, she's probably maybe 40, probably closer to 35. So relevant. I know for you that probably think she's a grandma, but trust me, folks, that's actually young if you're going to be sort of changing the world through data. And the point is that when she started out working, I guess she was getting her PhD at MIT. This is now about 10 years ago, 15 years ago. When she started out, the model to protect sepsis in patient data was usually using like 9 factors on a table to identify whether the patient would likely have an infection or not in the hospital. She used something like 9,000. It was 3 orders of magnitude different, and she was using weird data that nobody thought was going to be relevant, but turned out to be incredibly relevant. Room number, why is relevant. The payment information, what sort of credit card you paid if you were admitted and you used a credit card for some of your charges would be relevant. Now, for many of you, you're probably thinking to yourself, why would the room number be relevant for someone who's going to get sepsis? Or why would the credit card that they use, or debit card you use, why would that be relevant? Others of you are probably thinking, yeah, well, of course, that's stats 101. Like, room number would be relevant because if someone has an infection there because it's unclean, typically that room might be unclean. It's not the patient, but it attaches to the room itself. So one patient would spread that to someone else, or it's just not a hygienic room because the person who cleans it doesn't do a good job. You can totally see that being plausible. So why that might be a relevant factor, a strong signal. Payment information, as you may know, different card networks appeal to different banks of different customers. It used to be the case, not so much anymore, but it was the case for decades, that Visa typically went to better quality banks who had better quality, higher income customers. MasterCard was a little bit lower in the pecking order of it because they were this sort of a smaller company that was getting a smaller part of the market. And so these are poorer people getting MasterCard. And of course, sepsis, in fact, hospital infections is definitely related to the background of the person, the health of the person, the diet and hygiene of the person, and that is related to income. Okay, so those things, those were signals you could find out without asking a person what their income is, because you don't have that information. You're not going to get it in a hospital setting. Probably not. Shopping patterns in dementia. We don't know if this is true or not, but there's a little bit of evidence that suggests that people who are going down the route towards dementia you are able to see it in the patterns of their shopping behavior. Typically, they want to get the same brands and lots of them. Go to grandma's house and you open up the cupboard in the pantry and you see like 9 cartons of sugar. Like she's not, like, why? Because when she goes to the store, she thinks she needs sugar, she buys it, and it's always that same brand. It might be a telltale sign, and you might be able to identify it in your points card at Walmart, and as a telltale sign that the person is going in the path towards neurological disease. And of course, obviously, it's going to be the end of the rare cases. There's no such thing as a rare case. It's a rare case for that particular doctor, but if you have population scale data, there could be cases that are uncommon, but you're not going to have the doctor who doesn't really understand it because the doctor has a co-pilot, and the co-pilot totally has seen this 10,000 times before in a population of 300 million over the last 3 decades, because you've got the data. Okay, so I'm going to go super quick so we can have a conversation. So you now have the message of all that's to play for with some examples of using data in healthcare. What do I mean by a data duty of care? The way it works today when you go into any setting, but in particular a medical setting, is they use data to either justify their decision or to base their decision, but it's a nice to have. It's not a need to have. What we don't have is to invert the sort of the paradigm in which we don't think that we want to base it on data, but that we must base it on data. That at the core of what we do, the data is the driving point, and that we would never deign to create a diagnosis or to produce an answer unless data was brought to bear. You could imagine a world in which, you could have a doctor suing, a father suing a doctor for negligence because the doctor didn't actually look at what the algorithm's output was before he made his diagnosis for a child in an emergency room setting, and wanted to just freelance it and just go off on what he thought was good enough on at that moment, in the same way that you would have every pilot completely sued to oblivion by the survivors of the passengers if they turned off autopilot and tried to land the 747 on the tarmac without the aid of computer-assisted flight. So it's a positive obligation to use the data for decisions in activity or be held liable for negligence. Now, the legal test for the data duty of care, this is actually the British legal test, but it's not too different in America, is that the harm must be reasonably foreseeable, the proximity must exist, it does, and the liability is fair, just, and reasonable, which I would argue it would be. What that would do is it would force all institutions who have this data duty of care that the data must be collected. They can't just let it go away. It has to be collected and stored in a way that could be used. So the data has to be clean. Yes, that's a nightmare, and it's going to kind of it's going to be the Full Employment Act for business consultants, but bring it on. I'm all in favor because it's data, after all. It's empirical evidence of the universe to make the world better. The data then has to be, after it's collected, has to be analyzed, has to be stored, obviously cleaned and stored in a way that it becomes viable that it's inspectable, and that the output has to be validated. And I would also think the algorithm has to be open to inspection as well. It can be inspected not by the public. It doesn't have to be open as an open source. It can be open as in transparent, so that an outsider, like, if you will, a court master, which is the term for a person appointed by a judge who has an allegiance to the court and the court system, so thereby is impartial and is confidential, can inspect it, look at it, report back to a judge in a private setting or in a public setting, depending on if there's intellectual property right around the algorithm. But that just means that will be inspectable and it's open to inspection, which right now most of these algorithms aren't. And there's a good reason why, because if you try to look at what they're doing, particularly a lot of proprietary things, and also weirdly in the criminal justice system, it's completely shoddy. It's completely ridiculous. It doesn't even do what they proclaim for it to do, and they'd be open to liability if it wasn't shielded because of a proprietary claim. So we could imagine reframing this data duty of care in lots of different areas. In the workplace, if you have someone who gets ill and you identify that they've been, working, 14-hour days by looking at their pass going in and out of the building, you could say, hey, you should have known, employer, that your employee was being overworked, because in your data that existed, and you need to build the process in place to care for your worker, and the data could have told you that. Education, you can imagine in lots of different areas of society. Product safety would be another classic example where there's a data duty of care. You should be collecting the data. You probably do anyway for warranty information or for another consumer to optimize the product. If there's a digital component to your product, you can probably identify it. And you'd be able to, for product safety, alert people. And if you don't, you're in trouble. And I think that's a totally legitimate thing to have happen, be in trouble if you don't actually use data to improve your product for the safety of your customers. So there's lots of implications to this. And again, I'm going to race through it because I want to have a conversation. But consent, privacy, usage, and explainability. I think they're probably straightforward, but I'll explain what I mean in terms of consent. Is it easy to opt out, or do we deliberately make it difficult to? It turns out that there's a lot of areas in life where we make it as difficult as possible for someone to opt out. If there's a draft and you want to be a conscientious objector, you can do it, but oh man, good luck. It's not easy whatsoever. You have to go in front of a board. You have to explain that you're a Quaker. There's a lot. They don't make it easy whatsoever. In fact, a lot of people just give up and carry a rifle into war. Except for the most dedicated who are willing to. For pensions in the workplace, it's very thoughtful. A lot of businesses have said, if you want to opt out of our pension scheme, you can, but here are all the forms you've got to fill out, right? And the reason why is you want people to default into these things. And I think that we should do the same thing when it comes to the ability to have your data being used in a trusted environment. In Britain, this is what I had to fail. I was aghast that all I needed to do is tick the box and not have my data not used. I wanted to have to go in front of a parole board, right? And have to plead my case of why, like, oh, no way, can't do it, right? It's against my religion, right? And the reason why is the data is so valuable, and it'd be ridiculous to let people who haven't made a real informed decision, because who does for any of this stuff, to just basically tick a box and then the data is not shared. I think that's a tragedy. They should know better anyway. And of course, the irony is that when you ask people, you survey people, hey, should data be used in a public setting? People say, yeah, I love it. I think it's really important, very comfortable or comfortable. So, and I'll make these slides available so you can actually see the references. We need to reframe privacy. I won't go more into it, but you can automatically see why privacy rule. Actually, in America, privacy rules are much looser, so we probably don't need to do anything. We probably need to tighten them. But elsewhere, for example, in Europe, where privacy rules are much higher, we definitely need to loosen it so that we can actually use data for innovative purposes, like in healthcare settings. And in fact, Google's affiliate DeepMind got sort of slapped by the UK's information regulator for using data in ways that I think most people, if you looked at it, would think this is a completely eminently sensible way of using it, but it didn't comply with the most modest of infractions or of rules. And there was technically an infraction. There was no penalty, there was no fine, but it made headlines around the world, and they got beaten up in the court of public opinion, but not in the court of law. We need to rethink the usage. It's going to take a lot of political leadership. The experience of what happened during COVID with test and trace apps and track and trace apps for the public was abominable, because we had, we sort of dodged a bullet, because COVID weirdly, the initial numbers of COVID were quite dramatic in terms of what it would mean for people. But within about 6 months, it was clear that there was these huge, demographic segments of the population that really didn't have to worry that much. And so we had to protect the elderly and the vulnerable, but young people like yourselves, I mean, adverse incidences were actually quite uncommon. We didn't know that at the time, but it was interesting that no government did a good job, really none, in terms of having a straightforward conversation with their public about why this would be very useful. You could imagine something that an ailment that has different characteristics that is quite deadly and also has a lot of asymptomatic carriers in the population, where it would be really important to have this sort of app if the data is used in a trustworthy way that protects people's fundamental liberties. Big ifs. I totally get it. But it's crazy that we didn't even have that public conversation. I mean, shame on us, right? We have these public conversations when it comes to like what we do about nuclear weapons. But here we could face a world in which we have a similar death as nuclear holocaust, but we're not having that public conversation because there's no leadership behind it, except for people like me, and nobody listens to me because I'm a journalist. Finally, we need to reframe explainability. Sometimes we're going to lose causality. We're not going to know how it came to its conclusion, yet we can validate that it is accurate at this level, and we can continue to inspect that it remains valid, that it doesn't go off course. And so we probably need to rethink how we get explainability in our regulatory processes as well. So where does this take us all? The Guild will fight back. It's going to be an affront to what people think they know, in the same way that in previous examples, whether it's in terms of bloodletting or any other great innovation, people are going to say, we don't understand how this happened, and we resist it. Just a couple months ago, there was a fabulous paper that came out looking at fingerprint analysis, and I'll be very quick to say that when the researchers who came from outside of forensic science discovered that you could take a fingerprint from one finger and another and identify that it's the same person. This was a truism in fingerprinting science, that was impossible. All of the major journals in forensic science turned down the paper. They had to publish it outside of that specialty because it was overturning a truism of the specialty. But that's of course what science is supposed to do. So it was crazy that was the situation, and this just happened a few months ago. So it's a wonderful test case to show how the Guild just sort of blocks its ears when it hears something that is true, but against what they think is true. So what I think we're going to need in the future is not only artificial intelligence, but also human intelligence, the HI as well. And an example is the Toyota Andon cord in the Toyota production system. If you take your mind 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, what the world's going to look like, we will have this world in which data is going to be used everywhere. And in that case, the doctor is no longer going to be the medical professional at the highest level, most elite person, the doctor. That man or woman is not going to be interacting that much with the patient. The artificial intelligence is going to be making the decisions. The doctor's probably going to just be doing lots of other things, some administrative stuff and validating it. Still will be there. The nurse, however, is going to be the hand of the carer, who is going to be empathetic, compassionate, and will see things that the doctor will not see. In the Toyota production line, there's a cord going along the whole assembly line that any worker could pull at any time if they see a fault on a car. Fault in the line, pull it, we fix the fault so no other cars have that problem. And I think there's going to be a sort of Andon cord for nurses to pull it, and it's going to say, doctor, robot, take a look at this. Something is going wrong. I can't tell you what it is, or maybe I do know, but here's what I'm seeing, and I think something's amiss. And we're going to be prizing that, and we're going to have to sort of rely on the intuition of the nurse, of the carer, and I think it's going to be a human who's going to be dealing with another human. It's not going to be an algorithm that will do that. Lots of risks in the algorithmic society where we turn people into numbers. But I think that if we're a wise society, we will do the right thing. Are we a wise society? That's up for you guys to determine. Good luck. Thanks a lot.
Ken, that was excellent. Thanks so much for sharing. Do we have time for a little bit of Q&A?
Let's totally do it.
Okay, I'll kick things off because I have a question I'm curious about. You talked about AI making decisions in a hospital, perhaps instead of doctors. In my head, I can see like a problem in which at a certain point, like like in the example that you gave of the retina scans, where an AI is able to determine male versus female in a way that like the humans can't figure out what it's doing. Do you see that causing problems integrating AI into the medical field, where before we get to the point where we've completely released everything, AI is giving us responses that the doctor can't fathom, and so it creates like a conflict with them implementing those insights and decisions from the AI?
Yes and no. I mean, so let's unpack that. I don't think we're going to have anything going into practice that hasn't been extremely vetted and approved. Okay. In all the ways it's going to need to be approved. Are they going to approve a diagnostic or a therapy that does not have its causality stitched up cleanly? And I think the answer is going to be yes. So the doctor is going to know, oh, it's going to be one of those instances, right? And you can also imagine that, for certain things, let's take uh, lung cancer, right? Imagine right now we're at about 91% accuracy in our diagnostic of lung cancer, this kind of cancer at this stage that would require surgery, okay, or serious intervention. Let's just say 91% accuracy, which is not bad, but not great either. And that 9% blurs in both directions equally, okay, of people who are misdiagnosed. And we go from 91 to 94, okay, which is great. So we get 3 out of 10 people are now going to be saved, where otherwise they would have been misdiagnosed. And we still have others that are misdiagnosed. In that situation, not all cases are going to fit into that 3% category of using the AI and it not having causality, where we just don't know when we throw up our hands, right? So we'll still have that universe in which the algorithm will like diagnose the others, but we would have gotten the right thing anyway. And so we don't worry so much about it. And we might want to then verify it, to say through the old school methods, maybe by actually taking a biopsy rather than looking at like a urine sample, just making it up, or a hair follicle, right? But for that 3%, the medical professional will know, oh, it's part of that 3%. And the insurers will know, that, there's a 3%. And maybe we have to have a different form of disclosure and conversation with the patient and the patient's family. Maybe you have to sign a form of a consent form for the operation that explains very clearly that it's not clear that this operation is required, but we believe it is because it was diagnosed by an AI in this blurred area, and it might not indeed be required. But on the contrary, if we do open you up and we find out that it was needed, this is going to save your life, and otherwise you will perish. And a lot of people will probably be willing to, if you will, sign that extra level of disclosure. So the answer is both. We're going to live in a world in which we will have to take on faith things, but we're going to feel accustomed to it because we're going to have to build the guardrails, because it's going to be known that it's happening because it's already approved for practice.
Great response. Thanks for the insight.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So, thank you for a really fascinating talk. I was really struck by your theme of data, duty of care, and I just wanted to get your thoughts about the potential risks of bias in the patterns that are learned by these large scale learning systems that are learning from massive data sets that may have certain groups underrepresented in, and then there might be a risk that so what are your thoughts about those problems?
Oh, huge problem, right? It's like there's good news and bad news. Like the bad news, massive problem, right? Good news is it's a known problem. Okay, so now everyone can get to work to sort of realize it's a problem and fix the problem. Find more people who are representative to that category. Adjust your weightings in clever ways. Loosen privacy rules so you collect relevant data. Let me explain what I mean by that. When COVID struck, there was whispers and murmurs in the Afro-Cuban community in Britain that Afro-Cubans or the Afro-Caribbeans males were basically dropping like flies. It was the fatalities and incidence of severe COVID in that community was far higher. Just murmurs, right? And part of the reason why it was just murmurs is that there was, under the most well-meaning view of the medical profession of the NHS, they didn't want to collect racial information because they felt that it was going to almost be like eugenics and Nazism, right? But now think about it, it's ridiculous, right? Because when it turns out, when they were able to actually take that data that in some ways they were either collecting or not, or they could back into through names or addresses, et cetera, or then surveys, it turns out that it was legitimately true that that population, for whatever reason, something genetic, would, if you got COVID, you had a far higher likelihood of having severe COVID and having fatal COVID, okay, before the vaccinations happened. So if you knew that, you knew there's a vulnerable population, you'd totally take different steps to minimize the risk. So and there's lots of interesting examples of that where we didn't collect data under the well-meaning view of privacy rules, but in fact, we needed that data, that very granular data, in this case, sensitive data like racial data, to make better decisions for people, to save people's lives. And I'll just name drop a book that's very, very good called The Equality Machine by, I think it's Ori Loeb or Loeb Oriel. You guys are Googling it, you can do it, just The Equality Machine. She's a lawyer at like USC or something. I'm sure I've got all of this wrong. I don't have the name wrong, but The Equality Machine is the name of the book. It's great. And it's a friggin' slam dunk in terms of, again, reframing privacy to say, hey, we need to collect this data rather than think we're doing something good by not collecting it. She looks at, at the FDA regulating devices that have, far more terrible incidences of malfunction when it's put it into a female rather than for a male, but because they weren't collecting data on the sex of the patient, they couldn't identify that, because when you look at the whole cohort, it looks totally fine. But you can imagine if it's like 1% in men and it's 50% in America, rather in females, 25% doesn't look so bad. Well, actually it does, but you get the idea hypothetically. But of course, it's actually different. Yeah. So you need to do that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Come on. Yeah, go for it.
So if we're collecting all this data for over a long period of time, do you think that there are long-term ethical concerns if like our enemies get their hands on all this data that we're collecting on ourselves if other people aren't on their own?
So when you say our enemies, you mean like in a time of war, or even in
Yeah.
sort of a time of conflict where a hacker could come in and collect all this data on the population and know things about it that we would definitely not want them to know?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, that's a really, really good question. And it's very appropriate because basically 10 years ago, we wouldn't even be thinking about that. And now we actually need to. Turns out it's a super difficult. I mean, the answer is yes. And it's a super difficult challenge. And what would you then do? We could think about this together, just sort of like on the hoof. Where's the good news? Where's the bad news? So the good news is that if you collect this data, you can, it's going to be collected in a decentralized and disaggregated way. There's going to be no single like massive repository, or basically there shouldn't be, where it all is. Now, you do need to bring the data together if you wanted to analyze it. So what does that mean? That means Kaiser Permanente, which is one sort of healthcare group, and like United Health Partners, which is another, collects it. And you can imagine the Mount Sinai group and the Mass General Hospital group and TAMU and whatever, and UMich, and hospital group, inventing that, have it. And so it's not all in one single pool. But of course, the benefit is to actually bring it all together if you're a researcher. So if you're a researcher, you can bring it all together. Why can't you then just simply snarf it all up, right? So it turns out that there is a way to prevent that. It's a bit sci-fi, but there's running code now, but it's very complex, and you've probably heard of it. It goes through the acronym PETS, which stands for Privacy Enhanced Technologies, but it's homomorphic encryption, differential privacy, and federated learning, and secure multi-party computation, SMPC. So, as well as like these sort of data safe houses, but we'll leave that aside because the other ones are cryptographic and this one is just a storage technique. So in the cryptographic technique, it allows you to run analyses over encrypted data by just turning it into a very high-end and sophisticated math problem. It doesn't answer fully the privacy question, but it does say that there would be a way that a person like a researcher at TAMU who wants to collect all the data of, say, all of the private healthcare groups and run your analysis, not just on one, another, but all of them you can, but you would send encrypted, your query would be encrypted. It would go into the encrypted, so they wouldn't know what you're asking. Interestingly, that might be useful. It would go into the data that stays encrypted. You never get access to the data. The data stays with the steward, the custodian of the data. It stays encrypted, never gets decrypted, but you get the finding that you want, your answer that you want. It is possible, but there's a huge payload overhead in terms of processing power to do that because it's encrypted. And of course, you have to run the math, but you get the answer. Okay. So what that would mean is that an attacker who comes in would have to still do it disaggregatedly and would have to decrypt the data. So there are ways to protect it, but it is still incredibly vulnerable.
What do you think about, like, if the government is collecting data, or if a company is collecting data on their users and they're giving the data, do you think the company or the group is then responsible for turning around and then making all the data public through like an API, or are you just giving and there's no like getting back?
I think it depends on the model, right? So should your search data with Google be, attached to you and you be able to take it wherever you want to go or let other people use it, monetize it? I don't really think so. Nobody pays Google and I get a lot of value from it. So I think that's part of the transaction. When there was free over-the-air television, a la, before the year 2000, nobody paid me to watch an ad, but I never paid for The Simpsons. I never paid for the programming. It was free. And so that was the sort of the social contract of media. And so in that context, totally fine. But there's definitely going to be other contexts where people are going to want to own their data and protect it, where it's going to feel like it's a right of theirs and that they should be compensated for it. And I don't have a problem with that. In fact, as a good, sort of liberal economist, liberal as in freedom, I think that I want lots of models to, let 1,000 flowers bloom, have lots of different economic models, and let's see which are the ones that work in the marketplace that meet the needs of people, but also meet the needs of regulators and the values of a country. And those values of the country can be different. So what Sweden does and America does can be different.
Okay, in
So
the
guys,
interest of time, do you want to maybe call it there or answer one more?
no, I think you guys can do better. I want you to raise the octane of these questions. This is your big moment to sort of grill it to me, make it as challenging as it possibly can.
Well, with that
Michigan,
threshold, I don't know
Texas,
if anyone's going to volunteer to ask a question, but okay,
Lone Star
open it up.
State. Come on, bring it on. Exactly. 6-shooter questions. Anyone? You don't have to. I mean, don't have one contrived. But
I have a question. Do you think that you might end up with issues in collecting data? I know that you talked about collecting data on different racial subgroups, but what about collecting data on people who might feel like ostracized or scared of the medical community? What might the medical community do to deal with that type of situation? Do you know what I'm talking about? Does that make sense?
Yeah, completely. Yeah, you could take any vulnerable group, someone with disabilities, someone where the disability is just embarrassing, right? So it's not really disability, but if it got leaked, would end your career or would end your marriage. You can just imagine it. And you can also imagine it could be it doesn't have to be that, but it could be just any other characteristic where you feel awkward, or you're concerned that if it was known by your employer or your insurance company, it's an easier case that might deny you coverage, or other things would happen to you. So, so what do we do about people who have a natural and a sort of a legitimate wish to not share their data and have it be part of a pool? Well, I think that I'm really uneasy, of course, with that view, because the data is so valuable when you aggregate it together. It's a harder case to make that you are allowed to have this opt out in a nationalized healthcare service where healthcare is free. Now, I know I say this to you, a bunch of Americans who you sort of probably get healthcare through your university, and you're young, and so you're all probably pretty healthy, although you can never take that for granted. That's not the case. I sympathize. But it's interesting, in an American context, it's a shit show in terms of healthcare, where in the Europeans, and it's because it's private and costly. In Europe, it's typically free, but it's not as good, right? But because it's rationed in a way that it wouldn't be in America. But where does this hit in terms of collecting data? There has to be integrity behind it. It's easier to make the case I'm a payer, and it's private in America to you say, hey, I want to leave the system because of these reasons. In Europe, you might want to say, actually, no, you're a citizen, and just as we have conscription in the Nordics, and you have to serve in the draft, so too you've got to give us your data, and if you don't like it, give us your citizenship, give us your passport, and get out. Go to Russia, go to America, get your healthcare there, right? No, let me stay in Stockholm. So it's harder there, but what it says for any medical establishment is there has to be integrity around it. Everything that I've said relies on the idea that you have governance and that you've got values and accountability. And when someone does something wrong, bricks fall from the sky and hit them on the head. And that they don't escape punishment if they've done something wrong, if they've licensed your data and they shouldn't, if there's been a disclosure and they were negligent in how they stored the data. So I'm very sort of moralistic in that sense. In the same way that Adam Smith, when he wrote The Wealth of Nations, prior to writing The Wealth of Nations, he wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and he presumed when he was writing The Wealth of Nations that capitalism had as its bedrock values and morality and people doing well for their neighbors. Of course, that wasn't always the case, and capitalism has veered in lots of different directions over the last 200 years, 250 years since then. In ways that Adam Smith would have not liked, in the same way that Marx, at the end of his life, said that he was not a Marxist. I think Adam Smith, at the end of if he saw capitalism today, would say, I'm not a capitalist. This is not at all what I meant, private equity, and being just one example of that. So I do think that we need integrity in the healthcare profession, and the integrity of the data and of the values, that there's confidentiality that's protected, that is only disclosed in certain ways, that is anonymized in a rigorous way. If we don't have that, then we're never going to get the data society that we want. And people will suffer and die as a result of it. So we have to get it right.
Do you think that there could be benefit in overlapping data sets about human ailments and animals, like veterinary medicine?
Very interesting. Yeah, of course. I mean, my starting point is I think that there's far more that we don't know than we do know in all domains of life, and I want to stress all domains, and that data, and particularly AI, is going to help us bring us into this new level of understanding of the world. Whether that is our senses, we think there's 5, there might be 9 or 90. Intelligences, we have the theory of multiple intelligences from Howard Gardner, that it's not just IQ, but there's all these other dimensions to it as well. So that's really established. But in the case of senses, no. It was only 200 years ago less. It was about 1880 that we understood the electromagnetic spectrum. But before that, we didn't even know that there were radio waves. And now we can't even imagine a society in which we don't rely on radio waves at every moment of the time. So I think we're going to understand totally new features of reality through AI. And one of them may well be commonalities between animals and humans. We already do that, obviously, when it comes to testing drugs on rodents, on mice before we test, or pigs before we tested in humans. So we already understand there's some of that, but we might find out there's a lot more, and that would be great. And the final thought is the model for artificial intelligence is not the human mind, right? It was a little bit of that, but at the frontier, people are looking at all the ways that other animals are smart and are intelligent, that have are smart in different ways, and thinking, well, how can we build that into our systems? So we might have AIs that almost have a form of telepathy like dolphins, or don't rely on vision, but we already have, but bounce things off like radar, like bats. But the idea is you can imagine that there's lots of ways that we can pick up on the Francis de Waal view, the great primatologist, of, he wrote his famous book, Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are? And take that as a model and realize that we are not trying to build a human mind, but just all the different minds that exist in the animal kingdom, octopi mind. I think that we've probably reached the limit, but I just want to say thank you very much. I was really pleased when I got Tim's email. I'm glad this worked out, and I wish you all really the best of luck as you sort of pioneer an entirely new domain.
Kenneth, thank you
Thank
so
you.
much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Stay in touch.
Will
Good.
do.
Good night.
Take care. Good night. Bye-bye.
For anyone that's still here, I did throw the BSA attendance link in the chat. I'll throw it in again just so that nobody misses it.